Hello and Happy New Year, and welcome to the Overlanding podcast, the original podcast dedicated to vehicle-dependent travel. I'm your host, Andy Smith, and throughout the series I'll be chatting with adventurous people who have chosen to travel the world by bicycle, motorcycle, car and truck. The aim of the podcast is to discover what motivates people to embark on life-changing journeys and to hear some incredible stories along the way. Over the past couple of months, we've had some incredible guests on the podcast and heard some amazing stories. This week's podcast, though, is slightly different. We don't have any guests today, so unfortunately you're going to have to listen to me ramble on. Throughout the coming year, we're planning on putting together a few special podcasts which deal with very specific subjects. Over the past couple of months, we've had quite a few people contact us asking questions that we can then ask our potential guests. So rather than just ask individual guests, what we're going to do is put together a couple of very specific podcasts that deal with some of these subjects. For example, we're planning on doing a special podcast with lots of different guests on it, talking about writing books and how you get into publishing your own book as an overlander. This week's podcast, though, is based purely around a blog I wrote on our website, which is www.aroundtheworldin800days.com recently, which was very popular, and it was 10 things I've learnt as an overlander. I also presented this as a talk at the Adventure Overland show earlier in the year. So this particular podcast is predominantly aimed at people who've never been overlanding before. And certainly the 10 things in my list came as quite a surprise to me, really, being very naive before we left. So that's the kind of gist of today's podcast. Next week, we'll be back to having a regular guest. So if you're not a fan of this particular format of podcast this week, then don't worry. We'll be back to normal programming next week. Okay, so the theme of this week's podcast, like I said previously, was 10 things I've learnt as an overlander. And this kind of was born out of spending a lot of time looking at the internet and kind of witnessing posts that people would paste on Facebook of kind of like inspiring travel quotes that are wistfully floating over kind of awe-inspiring landscapes that were kind of designed to fill you with kind of wanderlust. And there are lots of classic quotes which get floated around the internet quite frequently. The world is a book, and those who do not travel read only one page, for example, by St. Augustine. And there are lots of these. Not all those who wander are lost, by Tolkien, which is a classic. A journey of 1,000 miles must begin with a single step, which also gets used quite frequently. The podcast today will be basically me imparting my own kind of wisdom and entering into the pantheon of travel writers who've kind of summarized this kind of awe-inspiring lust to travel into kind of bite-size, handy 20th century little catchphrases. I'm certainly not going to compare myself to some of the great authors that create some of these incredible quotes, and mine will certainly be probably quite unique, but nonetheless will be hopefully insightful to people who are potentially planning on taking an overland trip. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, number 1 in the 10 things I've learnt as an overlander is this quote: "Nothing says death like the smell of rotting flesh." Before we embarked on our adventure way back in 2010, I can't say I was particularly au fait with the pungent smell of death. However, since being travelling by car through 51 countries, I've become quite familiar with the particularly unpleasant odour of rotting animal corpses. Certainly, I think I got my first real smell of the stench of death as we travelled up through Russia, and we travelled quite quickly through Scandinavia and then into Russia because we had time was ticking basically on our Russian visa, and we needed the full duration of the visa to get across the entirety of the country. And so we had travelled quite quickly through Scandinavia and then arrived in Russia. We travelled through a good wedge of northern Russia, and it was there that we first kind of experienced the smell of rotting animals, basically. And quite often, typically, you would see circling raptors which would give you enough advance warning to wind up the windows before the kind of rancid smell kind of violates your nostrils. You would see big eagles circling in the distance, and quite often a lot of them, and that would be enough to signify that you were about to come across probably a dead cow, which is kind of in farmland just off the side of the road, or possibly large roadkill. But these animals don't get kind of cleared up, they just left to die and rot at the side of the road. And the smell is actually disgusting. And it's something I was completely unaware of before we started on our trip, but something I became very familiar with as we kind of travelled, really. And for every country that we travelled through, you would encounter it quite a lot. And it's not just the kind of smell of rotting flesh which is interesting, it's the whole approach to kind of animal death in foreign countries and outside of the UK, which is really a lot more honest than in England. You know, you buy your slice of meat from the supermarket and it becomes freshly packaged, and there's no association with the animal it came from, and you're very far removed from the death of animals. Whereas in foreign countries, you know, it's not unusual, especially in Southeast Asia, to see, you know, a couple of pigs tied to the back of a motorbike which are still alive and squealing their heads off, just, you know, on their way to the slaughterhouse. You know, butchers will be slaughtering animals in the street. We even went to temples in India where they were beheading goats, little baby goats as well, which is, you know, and when you're exposed to these kind of things, it's a lot more honest. It is pretty gruesome and it is pretty kind of disgusting, but I think it's a much more kind of not honourable way to live, but you know, it's more justifiable. If you know where your meat is coming from, then you don't mind eating it, then that's fair enough. But in the West, I think all that stuff is very much hidden from us. Okay, number 2 in the countdown is the more flags a country flies, the less you can trust its government. It wasn't really until we got to kind of Turkey that I started making the association between how kind of nationalist pride is related to the amount of flags that the government kind of flies. And these are obviously countries with some of the friendliest people we've encountered, but they're also countries with fairly dubious governments. There's a certain level of corruption that happens within a lot of these countries. And I kind of made a correlation between the number and size of the flags that are being flown with how dubious the government is, really. And it was generally a good indication of how kind of tantamount or how untrustworthy the government is. The more flags you see, the more you should be scared. And nothing kind of instills nationalism and patriotism, really, than hoisting a giant flag or a lot of flags. The giant flag in particular is an interesting one, which is very predominantly used in kind of Iran. We witnessed it all through Central Asia, all through the stands, all the former Soviet satellite countries. And preferably the bigger the flag, the better. And if it's bigger than your neighbouring country's flag, then even better. For example, in Tajikistan, which is actually Central Asia's poorest country, they held the world record for the world's tallest flagpole, which was 165 metres. It costs a whopping $3.5 million, if I remember correctly. And when you consider that Tajikistan is one of Central Asia's poorest countries, you know, how can the country justify spending that kind of money on a whopping great big flagpole? And it's purely so that they could outdo the country next to them, which previously held the world record. And incidentally, Tajikistan, I read an article recently about how Tajikistan, the government was associated with 200 stolen luxury cars which were tracked down. They were stolen from Germany. They all had GPS trackers in them. They managed to be tracked down and ended up in Tajikistan, and nearly all of them had managed to find their way to the president of Tajikistan's inner circle and associates of his family. So there's a great example of the correlation between how big your flag is with how corrupt your government is. Incidentally, I read that article on a news story on the internet, so allegedly. In southern India, the prominence of the hammer and sickle was a little unnerving, and it was something I was totally unaware that parts of India were are kind of heavily communist. And for Westerners, the image is really synonymous with the Cold War kind of era Soviet Union, and it's filled with kind of negative connotations. And to see this distinctive red and white flag flying so predominantly, it was an indication that the people of southern India may have kind of slightly opposing political values to our own. But again, like I said previously, you know, some of these countries are the most friendly we've ever visited, and to judge the actual people of the country on their governments is not right, but certainly it's a good indicator. If a country has a lot of flags, they generally have quite a dubious government. Number 3. I went to India to find myself. I found out I was a... And this one, number 3, was kind of born out of the fact that a lot of people go to India on a spiritual kind of search for spiritual enlightenment, I guess. And for many people overlanding, they generally try and avoid India, or if they do visit India, they travel through northern India on a transit and really quite quickly. And one of the reasons for this is that India is really the kind of Marmite of kind of countries, really. You either love it or you hate it, and it's incredibly difficult to get along and travel the way that we do, where you're camping every night or you're basically living outside, because our vehicle is quite small, so we spend a lot of time outside. And that's pretty much impossible in India, purely because of the population. It's incredibly difficult to find remote places where you can park outside and get on with your life. The nature of Indian people is that they are generally quite inquisitive, and the kind of social norms are incredibly different to the Western world. And so people tend to gather and stare, and it takes a lot of getting used to. It can be incredibly difficult to kind of get used to. So certainly in Rishikesh and Haridwar in the north, we witnessed kind of hundreds of Westerners who had travelled to India, you know, to kind of find themselves. And you know, this is kind of born out of, I guess, during the 60s, the Beatles brought it to the world's attention that, you know, Westerners could go to India to kind of find spiritual enlightenment. And ever since, I think a lot of Westerners have kind of either got something to run away for, or are searching for something and end up in Rishikesh and Haridwar. And it's quite interesting to see that they've kind of thrown their old lives away in search of something more meaningful. And for me, I find it quite amusing, because there were clearly people there who are just on holiday and kind of really got absorbed in the kind of Indian culture, and were wearing kind of like baggy yoga pants, and, you know, had a little red dot on their foreheads, and were just kind of trying to kind of absorb themselves into this kind of Eastern culture. I found it just really quite amusing, and after spending 4 months in India, I didn't really become enlightened in any way. The only thing I discovered was that I'd kind of turned into an intolerant, short-tempered, unreceptive, and I don't know, just generally quite frankly horrible person, because my kind of hard-earned, open-minded outlook, which I'd earned through a couple of years travelling, basically, the way we do, was really tested to the limit by people who kind of think it's okay to spit in my general direction. You know, Indians would come up to the car, just open the car door and get inside without asking. They would push and shove, and your personal space is continually just invaded at every opportunity. People have no concept of personal space in India, so they will stand close to you just constantly and stare at you, which is quite unnerving, and it's incredibly difficult to change your mindset and get used to that. And there were obviously times when I loved being in India, but I really did find it quite testing. And then on top of all that, there's all the rules and bureaucracy, and just to get used to that level of bureaucracy is incredibly frustrating. And we had to deal with quite a lot of government officials, Indian customs, to clear our vehicle out of Mumbai when we shipped it into Mumbai from Iran. So that takes a lot of getting used to, the kind of rules and regulations. And then on top of all that, there's all the filth and all the rubbish that goes hand in hand with India. And then there's the driving, which is just absolutely insane. And somehow through all this, I still managed to just cling on to my kind of polite English demeanour. I struggled. I really, really struggled. And all the kind of negativity that surrounded me at every turn, I guess was purely brought onto myself. I've only got myself to blame really for how I interpreted all those situations, but it slowly ground me down until the point I actually started to resent India and the kind of monster it had turned me into. But thankfully the duality of the situation meant that we did meet hundreds of amazing people who were friendly and open-hearted and willing to share everything they had with us. And we met these people on a daily basis, and they kind of helped maintain, a certain level of sanity. Number 4, never judge a road by a map. Okay, so forget everything you've ever learnt about estimating travel times, and that includes using Google Maps to plot your course from A to B. Roads around the world are incredibly unpredictable, especially as soon as you leave the kind of safe confines of kind of Western Europe. On one occasion, for example, in Greece, it took us 2 days to drive 10 miles. What on the map looked like a pleasant drive up and round a small mountain was just so horrendous. It was, actually, in hindsight, it was a lot of fun, but it certainly took us a lot longer than we expected. On the map, it looked 10 miles away, and we thought it would take us maybe an hour tops. But no, it took us 2 days. The road was incredibly muddy, incredibly steep. But on top of that, it was incredibly difficult to navigate because there were so many tracks through this forest that they would split off and join off. And so we ended up going the wrong way, having to turn around, having to come back again. And that coupled with kind of some fog and some rain and a lot of mud just meant that those 10 miles in particular were a bit of a chore. In northeastern India, what should have been about a 3-hour drive took us 15 hours. And in that particular time, we were trying to make it to the border, and so we didn't really have much choice but to continue. So what we had planned to be quite a leisurely drive to the border then took an entire day, and 15 hours behind the wheel is not really much fun. You can expect potholes, corrugations, mud, landslides, collapsed bridges, surfaces that are so ungraded that you question whether it's actually the road you're looking at on the map, and that your really expensive tyres are up to the job. Just incredible amounts of variation wherever you go and everywhere. What can look like a motorway on a map can often be the worst road in the country. In Kazakhstan, for example, which is a massive country, most of the roads were in really terrible condition, especially in the northwest. And if you need to drive across the entirety of the country, you need to make sure you have enough time on your visa. Kazakhstan is the 9th largest country in the world. It takes a long time to drive across it, and that coupled with poor road conditions can actually be not very pleasant. Armenia, again, was a great example of some of the worst road conditions, and there's really only one highway which crosses the country. Actually, I think there may be 2 highways that cross the country. We drove in one particular town where some of the potholes are so large you can actually see them on Google Earth. And I think as overlanders, you become quite seasoned to judging roads and distances by looking at a map. You can kind of tell what is going to be a pleasant drive and what is going to be a dull drive by the shape of the road and the contours on the map, and whether that road follows mountains or valleys or rivers. So you can generally get a gist of an idea of the type of road you're likely to travel, but trying to plan travel times is just really quite difficult. Okay, number 5. Stupidity is rife all around the world. The world is full of stupid people, myself included, from the kind of poorest of the poor to the top ranks of the Indian caste system, and from religious and political leaders, I guess, right through to the average man in the street. Kind of stupidity is demonstrated on a daily basis around the world, and as an overlander, you're highly likely to witness it. In some places, in poorer countries, for example, kind of stupidity out of necessity is endemic. If you have a family of 5, for example, and the motorbike is their only form of transport, all 5 people are going to travel on that motorbike. In the West, that kind of concept of may seem unsafe and stupid, but in a poorer country, that kind of is a necessity. It's a necessity to get on with your life. And motorbikes in particular are incredible all around the world, especially in Southeast Asia, India, through Central Asia also. You can argue that there's a great deal of intelligence, I guess, used to solving the problem of how you actually fit 5 people on a motorbike. And there's a certain level of intelligence and problem solving involved in carrying a washing machine on a motorbike, for example, or a door, or a large pane of glass, or on one occasion we saw someone carrying 5 computers on the back of a motorbike. So this kind of what we would consider stupidity is borderline kind of necessity, yeah, I guess there is a certain level of problem solving and ingenuity in how much you can actually carry on a motorcycle. But then there's the debate of at which point does it become unsafe and which point does it become stupid. But no doubt, as an overlander, you will witness incredible things being done with motorbikes. In Armenia also, we witnessed some pretty impressive stupidity. We were overtaken by a white larder on an icy mountain road. About 40 minutes later, we caught up with the larder. The driver had lost control. It had skidded off the road, and it was on its roof about 10 meters down an embankment. And there was a tractor there who was basically pulling it back up to the road. Maybe about 30 or 40 minutes later again, the same larder overtook us again, still travelling at 40 plus miles an hour on a quite windy, icy mountain road. Only now the roof of the larder was all battered in and pushed off to one side. And that kind of level of stupidity is just incredible. The fella hadn't even learnt his lesson. He was still driving at exactly the same speed in the same kind of horrendous conditions. In Kazakhstan, we witnessed again, it could be, maybe the guy was a child prodigy, but it's highly unlikely. But in Kazakhstan, in Almaty, we were driving in quite heavy traffic on the ring road, which is a pretty hefty motorway around the outskirts of the city, when we were overtaken by a car which was being driven by a 6-year-old who was kind of weaving in and out of traffic and overtaking kind of lots of other vehicles. Emma looked out the window, glanced at the car overtake us, and said to me, "There's a young kid driving that car." And I was like, "What? You've got to be kidding." She goes, No. And so we caught it up at traffic lights, pulled up alongside the car, and the dad was sat in the driver's seat, and he was relaxing with his arms behind his head, or one arm behind his head, and with a sandwich in the other hand, and was eating a sandwich. He was in charge of pedals and gears, and he left his 6-year-old son, who was sat on his lap, to do the steering. We managed to snap a photograph. The fella kind of looked at us, pointed, laughed, told us his son was 6 years old. They both smiled, happily posed for a photograph. Then when the lights changed to green, they kind of raced off again. So that's kind of just incredible examples of stupidity. But then right at the other end of the spectrum, there are governments. For example, pretty much every country we went through, we witnessed the Chinese basically exploiting anyone and everyone in every country we kind of went through, and the respective governments are kind of letting it happen at the expense of the environment and the people who live there. The majority of these countries that we had visited had been ravaged by major wars, for example, and there's nothing more horrendous and stupid and senseless than kind of war. And all these wars had happened generally in my lifetime. Like, a lot of the countries we travelled through had suffered from kind of civil wars or countries breaking down and looking for independence. And it's kind of tough, I guess, to distinguish who is stupider, really, the uneducated or the educated. And at every level, kind of greed generally outweighs common sense and quite often human life. So it's an incredibly sad state of affairs, really, that in this day and age, the world, is progressing very slowly and at times seemingly going backwards. But, who am I to judge, I guess? I managed to lose my spare wheel at one point, and I managed to get our car stuck in the middle of an open field. I've certainly done my fair share of stupid things whilst being on the road. Number 6. It's a big job, but someone has to do it. This entry should really be at number 2, I guess. Okay, how to broach this subject, I guess, without seemingly being too crude. When overlanding, you certainly become more aware of your bodily functions. For us, we travel in quite a small vehicle. We don't have the luxury of having an indoor shower or bathroom or toilet. We don't have a huge Unimog truck with a luxury apartment on the back with all mod cons. We're generally living outside. We're generally taking a poo behind a tree, digging a hole to poo in, or occasionally finding kind of public services. So you become a lot more aware of your bodily functions. And then on top of all this, your diet is changing frequently as you move from country to country. You're quite often eating in unhygienic places. You're sometimes drinking water from a dubious source. So diet change, dehydration, food poisoning, all these things play a factor into your kind of bodily functions. Throughout our journey and as overlanders, I was constantly amazed at what my body kind of produced, especially in the length department. I can happily say I don't think I've ever done poos as big or long, which were just mind-blowing. And especially if you're pooing outdoors, you become very aware of it. So, having kind of previously read that monitoring your bowel movements on expedition was a kind of key indicator to your health, right at the very beginning of our trip, I decided to keep a captain's log, which featured the date, a descriptive title. I invented a thing called GPS coordinates and recorded the firmness of my stool sample by using the Bristol stool scale. And I kept on, basically logged every time I went to the toilet in this. And recently I was doing some research about this for an article I was writing. And I found out on the internet that the largest fossilized human poo was 9 inches long. And I like to think that my important scientific work that I was doing in keeping my captain's log may help the archaeologists of the future to locate specimens which can clearly top this. And as much as I do like a bit of toilet humour every now and then, I'm sorry to lower the tone in this particular podcast. So swiftly moving on. Number 7. Sleep with the planet. By this, I don't mean a kind of promiscuous overlanding lifestyle where you go around sleeping with a person from every country, although if that's what floats your boat, then feel free to do that. But what I mean by this is kind of getting in touch with your circadian rhythms, which really does make a difference to how great you'll feel, basically. We sleep in a roof tent every night, and as we're living outside in quite a small vehicle, it becomes very difficult to pack up all your belongings in the dark. We obviously have lights and are used to living outdoors, but generally we go to bed when it goes dark, and we get up with the sun when the sun rises. Well, Emma does. I quite often enjoy a lie in. But as a result, you become generally feel a lot more healthy, and that coupled with living outdoors and camping in stunning, beautiful wild places halfway up a mountain or in a desert where the air is incredibly fresh. We frequently sleep with the roof tent windows wide open, so you're kind of sleeping in a much more natural kind of environment, and you will feel so much healthier for it. It occasionally becomes problematic. In Norway, for example, we were there during the summer, and so it never went dark. When we travelled through Georgia and Armenia, we were there in the heart of winter, so it was dark by 4 p.m. So in those particular circumstances, it becomes slightly difficult and especially difficult to maintain a kind of regular sleep pattern when it's like that. Especially in the winter when it's particularly cold and the nights are really, really long. For us, though, it wasn't unusual that we would sleep 10 hours a night, especially if the air is fresh and we've had a long day, and as a result, we generally felt so much better. One of the benefits to all this, though, is not only do you get to watch sunsets, which are always beautiful, you generally get to see the sunrise too, which is something that I only ever used to do after a heavy night out drinking and partying with my friends. But to kind of witness a sunrise with a clean head and with the whole day ahead of you in a beautiful location is absolutely stunning and something you don't ever get to do often. Number 8, expect the unexpected. When overlanding on a big worldwide trip like this, you are gonna just see some of the craziest things you have ever seen on a daily basis. Expect to be woken up by an Indian TV crew opening your tent. Expect to be on TV in Iran. Expect to be chased by sheep. Expect the road not to exist anymore. Expect rocks bigger than your car to fall out of the sky. Expect to see lots of guns. Expect to wake up covered in snow. Expect the bridge to have collapsed. Expect to see a Kyrgyz nomad carrying a severed horse's leg on the back of his own horse. Expect to see a holy man rolling down the road. Expect an Iranian truck driver to give you 40 litres of fuel for free. Expect to see a bus on its side. Expect to see vehicles falling off mountains. Expect your front wheel to fall off. Expect to see a truck half hanging over a cliff edge. Expect a monkey to piss in your face. Expect a huge monitor lizard to stroll through your camp. Expect wild deer to come and say hello to you in the evening. Expect your ice cream to be massive. Generally, expect the unexpected. All those things I just listed happen to us, along with many, many, many more on a daily basis. And you will be blown away by some of the unusual things you see. Number 9, less is more. As a result of funding our trip, we sold nearly all our possessions, and this is certainly something that's been covered in the podcast previously and is a recurrent theme which pops up. And it was a liberating experience. Living with few belongings really shifts the focus of what is important, and kind of materiality falls aside and basic survival comes to the forefront. So finding water, finding food, finding fuel, keeping clean, dry, vehicle maintenance, the real basics become what is important in life. And this is incredibly liberating and kind of helps ground you, and is very humbling and brings a little perspective to your life and is incredibly rewarding. You know, if you look at your lives within the Western world, where we're heavily focused on consumerism and buying the next thing and upgrading everything, and kind of, you know, you go to the shop and you've got so much choice. You know, you can buy 20 different types of tomato ketchup, or You've got everything at your fingertips. And it can become very easy to take all that for granted. And to be honest, a lot of the time, most of that stuff is not useful. You don't need it. You're searching for it, or you're buying it, to make yourself feel better, or to kind of add some worth to your life. So stripping back your entire life to a few possessions and really focusing on the basics is incredibly humbling. And I couldn't recommend that enough to anyone who's not even interested in overland travel. That is just general advice to everyone in life. Okay, number 10. We have reached the final number in our list of top 10 things that I have learnt as an overlander. Number 10, very simple. Never get a haircut in Armenia. This one is more visual, so I will post a picture up on our website and you can witness for yourself, because I'm pretty sure pictures speak louder than words. Okay, so that concludes our top 10 things I've learnt as an overlander. I just want to add that I feel like I've been a little bit harsh on India and Armenia, and I just want to reiterate that those are actually two incredible countries, and we did meet some incredible people in both those countries, and they're two amazing destinations for overlanding. So I just want to reiterate that. I don't want to put anyone off going to kind of India and Armenia. Okay, so that concludes 10 things I've learnt as an overlander. I hope you found it interesting, and certainly you can probably add your own to that list. One thing that is for sure is that as an overlander, and throughout the duration of the podcast, what's really come to light is that when people undertake trips like this, it really is a huge learning experience for them, and people will kind of experience all kinds of insightful kind of experiences and thoughts, which they'll take with them for the rest of their lives. And that's one thing that kind of overland travel and travel in this way and extended travel can really, really do. And obviously there are lots of other things I could add to this list, which would be a little bit more serious. And maybe at some point in the future I'll do another top 10. For example, travelling slower and taking your time is something that seems to be a common thread that keeps on popping up throughout the podcast series. If you want to travel for 4 years, proportionately, it doesn't cost 4 times more to travel for 4 years. It costs about twice as much, but you just slow down and take everything in. So all these kind of things are kind of learned through experience. So hopefully the things I've just told you now will help you when you're planning your own overland trip. And at future, we may do another top 10. Okay, so thanks for listening. Like I said, next week we will be back to a kind of scheduled interview in a typical format that we have done in the past. If you want to find out more about my own personal trip, you can check out my website, which is aroundtheworldin800days.com. On there, it basically documents the trip that I took with my wife, which was through 51 countries, and you'll find all this kind of information about border crossings, all that kind of stuff over on our website. You'll also find lots of bonus material and links on the overlandingpodcast.com. So if you like the show, please subscribe on iTunes and write us a review. This really helps boost our podcast up the listings and helps other people who are searching for overland podcasts to find our particular podcast. We love hearing feedback on how we might improve the show, and so we'd like to hear your opinion about what subjects we might cover in future episodes. So please get in touch via our website, which is the overlandingpodcast.com. You'll also find links to all our social media channels on there. If you're an overlander yourself and have an interesting story, we would love to hear from you. So email us at aroundtheworldin800days@mail.com. Please like, share, bump, give us a thumbs up and all that other stuff on social media. We really are keen to share people's stories, and we really do rely on other people helping spread the word so that the stories of other overlanders can get to as many people as possible. As usual, many thanks for joining us around the campfire. That's it for this week. Tune in next week. Goodbye.